All right, we are live. And hello, everyone. Welcome to the Week 15 Fantasy Life Sunday morning live stream. I'm Matthew Freedman, Matt at the Oracle, here with Chris Allen. And in the next, I don't know, hour, maybe we go a little bit longer if we still have lots of questions coming in. We will answer all, maybe not all, but a lot of your fantasy football questions. Of course, if we don't get to your question, check out everything we have on the site, not just all the free content, but the tools, the rankings, specifically the start sit tool that we have. So if you have the question, this guy or this guy, you can just go there, type it in, and it'll answer your questions. And then also feel free to interact with each other in the chat. More than feel free, definitely interact with each other. If you have a question in there, put it in there. People can respond to it, can give you their perspective, and we will give you our perspective on the show. Chris, it is the all-important week 15, the first week of the fantasy playoffs in the super majority of leagues. How are you doing?
I mean, I'm nervous. I'm nervous. People are counting on us to give them the critical information they'll need in order to set their lineups. So I know that we're going to do well, but at the same time, it's one of those where I can feel the weight of the fantasy season on our shoulders right now. So let's see if we can deliver a good one for the people.
I'm not nervous at all. I'm just
you were born ready.
I was born ready. And also I have faith. I have faith in our audience. They're going to make the right start sit decisions, regardless of whatever perspective we have. They have brains of their own. Hopefully we give them good guidance, but they're going to sort through all of it. And the decisions ultimately are on them. And I mean, I'm hoping that they, have been with us all along. They made the right moves on waiver wires, added the right people at the beginning of the season. They drafted with smart strategies in mind. So we've had the whole season to get to this point. I'm going to say our people are ready.
That's true.
They're ready.
You're right.
All right. Speaking of ready, let's get into the show. So I'm going to start by kicking it to you, Chris, for an injury rundown. So we have an article on the site that Chris, you do with Jorge, one of our editors. You guys just kind of run through all of the key injury situations. So some big, questions at the quarterback position early in the week in terms of, is it going to be Jay Kaner? Is it going to be Aiden O'Connell or Desmond Ritter? We have all those questions answered now. What are the big questions that we have in terms of injuries heading into kickoff today?
I think one of the bigger ones is Tony Pollard, running back for the Titans. Missed a couple of practices earlier in the week, got in a limited session or full session, if I remember correctly, on Friday. But because he has that matchup against the Bengals, Titans are home this week to Cincinnati. Run defense has been one of the worst in the league. Folks probably had a bit of, concern whether or not a guy like Pollard will be able to go, who's been sitting in that RB2 ranks so far throughout the season because the rest of the offense not really carrying their weight. Depends on which week you get them. But still, Pollard for sure has been one of the ones that we've been tracking since we saw him pop up with that DNP earlier in the season. But of course, all the way down at the tight end position as well, it's David Njoku, who's been earning over a 20% target share for the Browns. A little bit of rainy weather in Cleveland right now. I'm just 3 hours south of there in Dayton, Ohio, but up in Cleveland, a little bit of rain, but also with him going up against the Chiefs, who they are one of our better tight end matchups in our DVP tool, which is kind of shaky for tight ends. But still, David Njoku with his target share, that's another one that we've been tracking. But still, if you have any other questions, we'll try and get to them here on the show, but also take a look at the injury article that should be updated and available on the site.
Yeah, so I am assuming that David Njoku, who did not practice all week, I'm assuming that he's out. Technically listed as questionable, but I'm skeptical on that one. Tony Pollard, I am a little more optimistic that he is going to play. So that's where I am with those two injuries. But of course, other injury situations we might note while we're running through the questions that you have.
McConkey, all those guys.
Yeah, McConkey, yes. McConkey is a big one, not only just because he's the number one pass catcher with the Chargers, but he's playing in the 4:00 slate, which means you might have to make some decisions based on that, not knowing if he's available. What are your thoughts on McConkey? I'm a little bit more pessimistic on him just because I know he practiced every day limitedly this week before getting the questionable tag. That was the exact same situation he had last week before not playing. So in theory, he's a week closer to
Mhm.
being able to return, but we saw the exact same practice injury designation pattern this week that we saw last week. So I'm projecting him to be out, but what are your thoughts?
I'm also slightly pessimistic as well, because if he had the same practice frequency last week and they held him out of a much needed win type division game last week, I mean, yeah, he's another week removed, but what is the other than like they need to win, of course, and they still have a shot at getting into the playoffs, but do they really need to push him for this week? Josh Palmer, I think, played fairly admirable last week from the wide receiver standpoint. And of course, folks are probably excited about trying to roster Stone Smart at the tight end position with Will Dissly out as well. So unless we see something a bit more closer to game time and folks continue to check social media and see whether or not they have a bit more optimism around McConkey, I guess I'm not sure why they would try and force the situation. I mean, it's good to see him get more practices in, but I don't see why this week is any different than last week, which last week there was a few, the stakes were slightly higher for week 14.
Yeah. It's a real sign of where we are in the football season that the two guys you mentioned, Josh Palmer and Stone Smart, both of them I ended up mentioning in my favorites articles this week.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Josh Palmer, I mean, he had was like 9 targets last
Yeah.
week. I mean,
Yeah.
like that's not nothing. All
QJ
right.
played well too. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. All right. Let's get to the questions here. First one. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning,
Good
Arizona
morning.
Mountain Man. Thank you for the early morning info. Superflex League, 6-point touchdowns. Mahomes, Gino, or May need to. Okay. Gotta say, just off the top, I love the 6-point passing touchdown leagues. I've said it before. I will say it again. I think it is a great way of making the quarterback position more important without necessarily needing to go to super flex. Although in this league, you guys did both. You went super flex and you went 6-point passing touchdowns, which, hey, I don't mind. Okay. So Mahomes, Gino, or I'm assuming this is Baker Mayfield. Mahomes, that total in Cleveland has dropped precipitously. So it was 45 earlier in the week, and now it is 41. Just, very few points expected in that game, which, of course, means you would expect fewer passing points, just less passing production in general for the Chiefs. Seahawks at home. That game is the Sunday night football game, I believe,
Correct.
hosting the Packers. Packers, again, without Jair Alexander, also without Javon Bullard in the secondary. So a better passing situation for Gino than you would normally expect given the matchup. And then Baker Mayfield, the Bucks are away playing the Chargers. Chargers pretty stingy on defense this year. What are your thoughts on the 3 of those quarterbacks, knowing that we want 2 of them?
Wait, is it Mayfield or is it May, like Drake May?
That is a great question. You know what? I think it's Drake May.
Okay.
Perfect. Yes. Okay. My my mistake on setting that up. Yes. So you have Drake May coming off of the bye. Thank you for correcting me there. Drake May coming off of the bye, playing the Cardinals on the road. Cardinals pretty exploitable in the secondary as well. So thoughts on those 3?
I think I'd go with Geno Smith out of that group, even though you do have the later game you don't really have a way to since he plays in the later game, it's a more difficult decision since you have to wait for him to go. But as you mentioned earlier, with the Packers injuries to their secondary, Geno's still ripping it like downfield. And my guess is for this one, we get a more healthier version of DK Metcalf. Haven't seen his same injury concerns over the past couple of weeks since he came back from the knee injury a few weeks ago, also dealing with the shoulder injury. And of course, since we do have Zach Charbonnet that will be the starter, Kenneth Walker out, and also having Jackson Smith and Jigba, I think that wide receiver core I would trust a bit more than what Mahomes is working with. Then also Drake May. Yes, the rushing has been there for Drake May, but going up against the Cardinals defense, they have been fairly stingy to quarterbacks over the last 4 to 6 weeks. So I think out of that group, I like Geno, but I can see the case for him or even Patrick Mahomes and what should be, I'm thinking might be a back and forth type of matchup, even with the down total.
Okay, I would go Mahomes number 1. He's the guy that I would lock in. I think lower ceiling than we normally have with him, but I still think a decently high floor. And then it's between Gino and Drake May. I would go with Gino in that spot, but they are very close in our consensus rankings that we have on the site, both of them near the top of tier 3. Gino actually at the top of our tier 3 rankings. I would go with Gino as your super flex guy, but it's very close between those two. All right, next question here from Zach Z. Neighbors or Taylor PPR keeper league? So starting CD, Tyreek, Mixon, Charbonnet, looking for the final piece for the first round of the playoffs. So obviously love the guys that you already have locked in to the lineup. And then it's between Neighbors, and I'm assuming this is Jonathan Taylor. Any other Taylors that I could be thinking of? I'm going to assume this is Jonathan Taylor here.
Nobody comes to mind.
Yeah. So obviously with Malik Neighbors, you have the attraction of getting a ton of targets. The downside is that he's going against the Ravens. Their secondary has been more exploitable, but he's going against the Ravens as a 17 home dog, which is like literally like the largest spread against a home team since the 1960s. Just absolutely terrible stuff. And he has Tommy DeVito throwing the ball to him. DeVito, maybe a theoretical upgrade on Drew Lock, not like in general, but specifically for Malik Neighbors. Maybe it's just DeVito gets tunnel vision and gets like 10 targets to Malik Neighbors in this game. But then you have to ask yourself, what are those targets worth? Like, we are expecting the Giants to score so few points in this game that you at least have to consider Jonathan Taylor. The Colts on the road playing the Broncos, underdogs of, I believe, 4 points. So not also a great setup for him, but you at least feel kind of confident that coming out of the bye, the Colts are going to have like close to their full package on offense. What are your thoughts here?
In a PPR league, I lean more towards Malik Neighbors. I know the offense has been horrific. I mean, bottom 3 in pretty much every offensive metric that you can think of, with either, I know it's going to be Tommy DeVito today, but even the mix of the two. Without Daniel Jones, they've been terrible. They were averaging over 30 yards per game or 30 yards per drive. With Daniel Jones, it's been around 20 without him. So I can see a scenario where you get a bunch of targets, more like the Wan'Dale Robinson stat line. It's going to be like 6 for 60, 7 for 50, somewhere in there. That would be my general expectation. My problem with Jonathan Taylor is that because he's been getting most of the rushing work, it hasn't amounted to a lot from an efficiency standpoint. And going up against the Broncos defense, who's one of our worst defenses to face from a running back standpoint. I mean, they haven't allowed 100-yard rushers since they faced Derrick Henry, and that feels like a lifetime ago at this point. Only allowed, I think, 3 rushing touchdowns on the entire season for at least going to running backs. I would say Malik Neighbors, especially because it's PPR. I give the edge to Neighbors on this one.
I would say, and this is not even a cop-out, but really like the way that I would think about this, I would say if you're looking for floor, I would go with Jonathan Taylor. If you're looking for the ceiling, I would go with Malik Neighbors. Like, I think Neighbors, especially with PPR and the potential volume he could have coming his way, I think he certainly has the higher ceiling. And you could see a situation where Neighbors has like 8 to 10 receptions for 100 yards and a touchdown. And I think that is just a ceiling that Jonathan Taylor does not have at this point.
No.
All right. Question from David Tendler. Gentlemen, had Cup and need help. Yeah. I feel
Everybody
you there.
does. Yeah.
Do I roll with Justin Herbert or Anthony Richardson? Okay. Love this question here. Herbert, I think, has looked really good since the week 5 bye. But of course, missing some weapons now, assuming that he is without his number 1 receiver in McConkey. Anthony Richardson coming out of the bye should be pretty healthy. I still lean towards Justin Herbert. I like the matchup that he has against the Buccaneers, who are significantly injured in the secondary. Let me just make sure I have this right here. So they will definitely be without their strong safety, Jordan Whitehead, who is on IR. And then they are definitely without free safety, Antoine Winfield, who's out with a knee injury. They are without their number 3 safety, Mike Edwards. And so they're missing like their top 3 guys on the back end of their defense. And then they could also be without backup cornerback Josh Hayes, who would maybe get a little bit more playing time with all those other guys injured.
Couple of
And
linebackers out too.
yeah, that's right. A couple linebackers are out. And then strong safety Christian Isian, who sometimes plays in the slot, but they've shifted to safety with some of the injuries. He, I think, probably plays, but he also has a groin injury and is listed as questionable. So, like a defense that is exploitable in the secondary anyway is injured on top of that.
Yeah.
So, even though Herbert is missing his number one wide receiver, I do prefer him. And I would say maybe if you're looking for, this might sound counterintuitive because we think of rushing production as giving a guy a higher floor, and it does. But I would say if you're looking for ceiling, I would go with Justin Herbert. If you're looking for floor, maybe I would go with Anthony Richardson because of the rushing production. But like Richardson is also a little bit different than your typical running quarterbacks in that he struggles to complete even the most basic of passes, which means like even though he has a theoretical high floor because of the running, that floor can also be like pretty faulty at points because maybe he just like completes only 10 passes in this game.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on Herbert versus Richardson?
No, I think it's Herbert for sure. Going back to week 7, the only quarterbacks that haven't gotten over 20 fantasy points against the Bucs have been the Raiders quarterbacks. So that was the mix between Desmond Ridder and Aiden O'Connell and Tommy DeVito. I mean, those are the only guys. Everybody else has gotten on them. I mean, I think, was it Brock Purdy like dunked on him for over 20. Lamar got over 30 points against them. Anybody that can throw well or accurately against them, and we know that's definitely not a problem for Justin Herbert. I think he has to be him for this week.
Yeah, and Herbert, you know, he was injured with the foot in the first month of the season, got the week 5 bye, got a little bit healthier. He's had a little bit of rushing production since then. 200 yards, 2 touchdowns rushing since the week 5 bye. So it's not like he gives you nothing as a runner. He also has the ability to give you a little bit there. So
I think the high ankle sprain or potential for a high ankle sprain that he had after the primetime game last week, I know that's generally a concern, but I'm more looking at what his passing production is going to be in this one. The rushing had been like the cherry on top for a guy like Herbert, but with as well as we saw from like Quentin Johnston playing last week, and even with Josh Palmer, Stone Smart, all of the options that he has for him right now, they should be able to get through this Bucs defense and get him those 20 points that we've seen from everybody else that have played the Bucs.
Yeah. And I'll say, I tend to, this is maybe like a fault of mine. I tend to take the injury reports kind of at face value. And so like Herbert practiced fully on Friday, like not listed at all with an injury designation coming out of the week. Like I think he's pretty much like fully ready to go. But I mean, of course it is football. He was listed with an ankle and a thigh injury. It's like, he's playing through something, but
he took some shots.
Yeah, but he's playing, and I think he's going to be pretty much his full self there.
Yeah.
All right. Question from Jelly of the Month. Shout out Jelly. Pacheco or Waddle half PPR flex should be a favorite. Great context. So you are a favorite in this matchup, which means I think you can take it. I wouldn't say take it a little bit easier, but you're probably looking more to just lock in points in the flex versus you need your flex to win the matchup for you. With that in mind, I would probably lean a little bit towards Pacheco, but it's close. I do like what Waddle has done in the past few weeks. Like the offensive has shifted a little bit more back towards him versus what we saw earlier in the year. And Pacheco, even though, you know, I think he's the lead back, he still has to deal with Kareem Hunt there and Samaje Perine stealing catches. So what are your thoughts here?
No, I give it to Pacheco. Last week, 58% of the rushing attempts. So that was his first time over that, like since coming back. And at the same time, we saw Kareem Hunt, his snap count tick down. Samaje Perine snap count, it ticked down. So while both Hunt and Perine have their roles, Hunt more in the short yardage type, Samaje Perine playing in the 2-minute, like sometimes obvious passing down situations, it's Pacheco's backfield. And even though they're going up against the Browns, and they are something of a tough out from a running back standpoint, I do think there's a scenario where you get the volume and the touches necessary from Pacheco, because he was also got a couple of targets last week as well, that he be the better option over Waddle. Whereas with Waddle, folks, if you go get that tier 2 subscription over at fantasylife.com right now and just look at his utilization game logs, it's been 20% and then like 9%, 20% and then 9%. He has really oscillated between being a wide receiver 1 and a wide receiver 4 every other week. And now this is the week he comes off of one of those 20% plus target games just this past week. So it's not to say that that's the trend that's going to hold, but because Tua Tagovailoa has Jonnu Smith, Tyreek Hill, Devon Achane, and multiple other options, we can see a scenario where you can where Waddle does have one of those maybe 5 or 6 target games, whereas with Pacheco, the trend is already moving towards him being the running back 1 that we saw in the earlier parts of the season. So if he's already a favorite, I think Pacheco is probably at least for me, the easier option of the two versus trying to consider what Waddle may or may not be able to do against the Texans secondary.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, Waddle is certainly the more volatile of the players. I do like, I will say, the matchup for Tyreek Hill. This feels like a Tyreek Hill game, which means maybe just kind of out of necessity, there's a little bit less there for Jalen Waddle.
Yeah, no Jalen Petrie for the Texans, if I'm remembering correctly.
Exactly. Petrie's on IR. So and I think that benefits Hill a little bit more than benefits Waddle. All right. Next question here. From Mark Schaffner, Dowdle, Rachaad White, or Higgins, pick one for the flex full PPR. All right. So we have Higgins, who didn't do much last week. Like one of the guys that I wrote up in my favorites article, like Higgins at that point was number 1 in utilization score, which is our proprietary metric on the site that looks at like all of the factors that go into fantasy scoring, and has actually been more predictive for projecting fantasy scoring going forward than just like raw fantasy points, like a fantastic number. And you could just look at it in terms of like how many targets was T Higgins getting versus Jamar Chase getting when they were both healthy. Higgins was actually out targeting Chase entering last week. And then Chase just absolutely dominated and Higgins didn't do much, which could make people a little bit more hesitant on Higgins this week. But I still think of Higgins as pretty much a locked in high end wide receiver 2, if not low end wide receiver 1, based on the volume that he normally gets. But then you have Rachaad White, who I think will probably be without I'm blanking on it, without Bucky Irving.
Yeah.
I think he will be without Bucky this week. And then you have Rico Dowdle. I will say I've been impressed with what we've seen out of Dowdle. And like week 8, he was inactive. Since then, he's been the lead back. And it seems as if the team is getting more confident in him each week. So he was a guy that I wrote up in my favorites article this week. What are your thoughts on picking between these 3 guys?
So I think White is the one that I would almost immediately X out of this grouping because Bucky Irving is expected to play here.
Okay.
So we can see a easier path to touches for T, assuming that they get back to their normal split between him and Jamar Chase. Because only 2 games with since he's been healthy and active that he's been under a 20% target share. And that's with Jamar Chase and Joe Burrow, like both out there, like they're doing their thing. And with Rico Dowdle, we've seen him really take over around 60 or 60+% of the Cowboys backfield. So I'd say it's between those 2. And I'll always be the Bengals biased guy and think that going up against the Titans secondary, that it should be a T game out of that. So I would say T for ceiling, Rico for floor. That's how I think I would look at those 2.
This is great. So you're gonna go with the Bengals guy. I'm gonna go with the Cowboys guy. I will say, thinking about it in terms of ceiling versus floor, T Higgins, especially in full PPR with the target volume that he gets, I think he does have a higher ceiling. Dowdle, I think at this point has a pretty decent floor, but I think he's also got a decent ceiling at this point. And I will say, I know that the Cowboys are underdogs, but let's just come on. They are going against the Panthers. This is the first game of his NFL career in which Bryce Young has been favored.
Yeah.
Like the Panthers should not be favored by a field goal against almost any team in the league.
Right.
And with Cooper Rush, the Cowboys have actually been pretty good against the spread and on the money line. The Bengals, I mean, good spot for them going against a Titan secondary that is missing its number one cornerback. But I just think it is the Cowboys going against the Panthers, who, by the way, have one of the worst defenses in the league. Like, just
Yeah.
absolutely great matchup for Rico Dowdle. So I would go
Mhm.
with Dowdle in this spot. All right. Question from Chris Edwardson. Start three from Ridley, Judy, London, Thielen, Garrett Wilson. This is a tough one because
Mhm.
it feels like all of these guys are kind of in a tier together. And I like a number of these guys as well. Like, for instance, Thielen. I know it's like pretty easy to think of him as like a wide receiver 3, but like the dude has actually gotten like wide receiver 1 usage the past couple of weeks. And I think he has a pretty decent matchup now going against the Cowboys.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on all 5 of these guys? And like, let's start with like, which ones are you kind of thinking of? Like, this is the guy that I'm eliminating first to kind of make this more manageable.
I think the guy that I'm eliminating first out of that group would be Drake London. Out of that grouping, I know that the targets have typically been there for him, but it's just the reliance on Kirk Cousins. So I'm just looking at those guys and thinking about the people that are going to be throwing them the ball. And if you're not going to be one of the higher end like target earners like out of your group, and I know that London has, but I would say like out of that group as a whole, London sits down at the bottom of that group in terms of target share, where we've seen Judy without Cedric Tillman, who's not expected to play this week, pop up for 25+% of the targets.
Yeah.
Ridley, we know, getting the targets. Thielen, we know, I mean, all of the rest of those guys. So I think London's probably the one that I X out first. But especially even for his, I know with going up against the Raiders, no Max Crosby for this week. So there's a little bit more pressure off of Kirk Cousins' shoulders. But I think London's the easiest one. Out of that grouping, I think I like Calvin Ridley the most, and that's going up against the Bengals secondary. And with Ridley also earning 25+% of the targets, around like averaging around like 14, 15 air yards per target as well. It's those volatile and deep targets from Will Levis that make him something more of a tougher play. But we've seen a number of wide receiver ones going up against the Bengals defense and come out on top. It's hard to pass up that type of usage and also the environment for Ridley. So I think it's Ridley, but I can see a case for Thielen. I can see a case for even Garrett Wilson for this week as well. But I think Ridley's the first one that sticks out to me.
You know what? I mean, by rankings, I have London, Judy, and Wilson as the guys I would go with, although Ridley is right there with that group. But if I'm looking at the consensus rankings, Ridley is at the top of a tier, but still a tier below. And so as a cohort, we have London, Judy, and Wilson in tier 3. And then in tier 4, we have Ridley and Thielen. So I would go with London, Judy, and Wilson. Cedric Tillman out definitely with a concussion. So that's definitely great for Judy. Wilson, great matchup against the Jags, and Wilson still getting a lot of targets. And then Drake London, I know it's not a great situation where you have the quarterback throwing to him, a statuesque quarterback at this point, but at least Max Crosby is out for the Raiders. And so maybe it's a little bit easier for Kirk Cousins to stay on his spot and to pass. London still has, I think, pretty good target volume coming his way. So I would go with London over Ridley, over Thielen. Those are the 3 I would go with. But like it's close. It's
They're all
close with
really tightly
all
there.
of those
Yeah.
guys.
Yeah.
All right. From Jeremy Brunk, need an Oracle. Don't we all, my man? PPR flex. Devontae Smith, Elijah Moore, or Sincere McCormick. All right. So the Raiders have Alexander Madison coming back this week. And Antonio Pierce has said Sincere McCormick will still be the lead back, but there's a question as to exactly what that is worth with Alexander Madison potentially rotating in. And then also with Desmond Ridder, your third string quarterback, now under center for the team. So questionable as to how much you would really get out of Sincere McCormick in this spot. Of course, questionable also the number of targets that Devontae Smith might get in an offense that is just not throwing the ball all that much. And when it is throwing the ball, going to A.J. Brown a high percentage of the time. And then Elijah Moore in a matchup against the Chiefs. Elijah Moore, no Cedric Tillman, so could function as the number 2 pass catcher, especially also with David Njoku, in my opinion, trending towards being out. So
Yeah.
an elevated situation for Elijah Moore versus what we would normally expect for him. What are your thoughts on these 3 guys, Chris?
Yeah, I think it's Elijah Moore and then Devonta Smith and then Sincere is how I would probably rank those 3. Elijah Moore, 20% of the targets in the 2 weeks without Tillman in the lineup. If we remove not just Njoku's target share, but also his short area targets, that David Njoku, I mean, averaging around like 5 air yards per target so far. So if we get the slot work for Elijah Moore on top of the short area stuff, that's where I think his floor, and especially in a PPR league for Elijah Moore, like really starts to kick up there. Whereas for Devonta Smith, going up, having to contest, going up against AJ Brown for targets, squeaky wheel AJ Brown for this week as well, with all the stuff that's been going on in the media with the Eagles passing game. So I think it's Elijah Moore without too much hesitation there.
Yeah, I agree. And great point about the short area targets, because I do think that is where he's going to get a decent chunk of the work with no David Njoku. And in full PPR, that means a lot because those targets are pretty easily converted into receptions. So I think that's a good call out there. I would go with Elijah Moore. Although I will say it feels dirty to go with Elijah Moore over Devonta Smith.
Yeah.
But a lot of it is just circumstantial. No Sincere. No Cedric Tillman, no David Njoku. I think elevated opportunities for Elijah Moore.
And Pittsburgh's defense is pretty tough too for Philadelphia, so it's not like he has an easy out as well.
Yeah, good point. All right, question from Jimmy Boy: Bucky, Sincere, or Tracy? All right, so Bucky did not practice the first 2 days of the week. Did get in a limited practice. Chris, you're thinking that we do see Bucky go in this spot?
Expected to play.
I'm going to be a little bit more pessimistic about the workload that he gets. And I'll remember, Chris, on this show last week, we were getting questions about Bucky, about Rachaad White. And I remember I was a little bit skeptical on Rachaad White. And you were like, it could be a situation where Bucky, pretty injured entering this game, suffers an re-aggravation of the injury. And that is what happened. He left the game early. Rachaad went off. Like, I'm just a little bit more gun shy now when it comes to Bucky. Like, I don't know if I want to fire on him the way that I would have ordinarily. Like, I thought he was looking great the past month or so. And then last week, people put him in their lineup. He ended up disappointing them. I would just be skeptical about Bucky again, even if he doesn't leave the game early, knowing that he exited last week early. The coaching staff might pull back a little bit on the usage that he gets. We talked about Sincere, McCormick, and then you have Tracy. I will just say I am super skeptical on Tyrone Tracy this week. Like a 16 and a half, 17-point home dog going against a Ravens defense that is one of the best run stopping units in the league. So super skeptical on Tyrone Tracy. But what are your thoughts on Bucky, Sincere, and Tracy?
I'm with you as well. I mean, the Ravens defense, they've been like top 5 in our DVP matchup for limiting opposing running backs rather. So Tyrone Tracy, even though he does get some of the passing work in an offense where we know it's going to be limited with Tommy DeVito, I want no part of that. And the health concerns for Bucky already kind of X'd him out of that trio for me. So I would look at Sincere, McCormick, and we've seen a number of running backs go up against the Falcons defense and come out decently on the other side. Aaron Jones just scored a touchdown against them in PPR leagues. He got about 16 points. Javonte Williams even got into the box against them. Alvin Kamara did well. So I would say with the workload and also the environment, I think it's Sincere that's the best option out of that group, which feels kind of gross. I mean, that's how you know we're at week 15. Sincere McCormick. That's how you know.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about 3 guys who started the season pretty off of the fantasy radar, which, we're at week 15 at that point at the running back position. Yeah, I would say, I think that Bucky Irving, in terms of the projections, Bucky would probably be the guy that you would go with. But I feel much less certain about him being able to live up to the projections or to complete the game. And so I think from a risk mitigation standpoint, even though McCormick probably has the slightly lower projection, I would probably go with McCormick because I feel a lot better about him hitting that projection or at least coming close to it. Whereas like
Agree.
Bucky could have a really wide range of outcomes that skews to the negative.
I agree.
So yeah, that's how I would look at this.
Mhm.
All right, question from Gustavo: Kyler or Bo Nix? Love this question. Just an absolute sign of where we are in the season. Kyler started the season really hot. Bo Nix started the season looking like a guy who potentially might not be long for the league. But I mean, Bo Nix has gotten incrementally better. Now he's at home. He's coming off of the bye. Like we have him in that second tier of quarterbacks, and that's a big tier of quarterbacks, but he's near the top of that second tier. I think he's a low end QB1 in this spot. Of course, Kyler also a low end QB1. I have Kyler a little bit ahead of Bo Nix, but they are close. They are next to each other in our consensus rankings. What are your thoughts on Kyler versus Nix?
I go with Kyler, and my concerns are with Bo Nix, and just it's a 1 game sample, and I'll just completely cop to it. But in that game a couple of weeks ago, when they played against the Cleveland Browns, he had one of his highest average depth of targets from a passing standpoint, over 10 yards per attempt. And now we've seen 2 to 3 weeks where we have not seen the rushing from Bo Nix. I mean, no design rushing attempts, limited as a scrambler. Really, just the only rushing attempts that's counted for Bo Nix has been when he's kneeled down. So if we're not getting that, and he was a bit more erratic in his last game, I just want to see 1 week of him trying to go back to where he was at towards the middle parts of the season. And therefore, Kyler Murray going up against the Patriots defense, that they've allowed over 20 points to opposing passers 3 weeks straight. And that's not just from your typical drop back passers. I mean, yeah, Matthew Stafford lit him up for a few touchdowns like 3 or 4 weeks ago, but even Anthony Richardson played well against him in that comeback game. So it's been different archetypes of quarterbacks that have played well against the Patriots defense. I'm not really concerned about Christian Gonzalez against Marvin Harrison Jr. I would say this is more of a Kyler Murray game for this week, at least relative to Bo Nix. I think it's Kyler Murray for me.
Yeah, thinking about this a little bit more, I like that Kyler is playing indoors, whereas you have Bo Nix playing outdoors in Denver. Potential cold weather there. So I like the perfect environment there. As you mentioned, the Patriots defense is not what it once was. So I think maybe a little more exploitable than the Colts defense. I will say, if you are looking um, kind of, if you're projecting a little bit, I'd say like wish casting a little bit. If you believe in the trajectory that we've seen from Bo Nix so far this season, and you think, all right, maybe he levels up a little bit more out of the bye.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're just kind of like chasing the upside a little bit, I might go with Bo Nix over Kyler, but it is close, and shooting from the hip, I would go with Kyler. I think Kyler has the higher floor, but Bo Nix might have that sort of blow up game out of the bye to where it's like, oh man, like he and Sean Payton are really starting to jive together.
Mm-hmm.
So I would just kind of say maybe that's the way that you think about it. I would go with Kyler there. All right. Tua or Darnold. I love the questions like this because I like questions that involve Bo Nix, that involve Sam Darnold, and like
Yeah.
guys that at the beginning of the season, if I had told you you will be considering starting this guy in week 15, you would think to yourself like, man, my season must have gone really
It's been
bad,
terrible.
and
Yeah.
I'm in the consolation bracket.
Yeah.
But no, I mean Sam Darnold obviously has been great in that system with the Vikings. Tua has looked really strong since coming back from injury. Sam Darnold versus Tua, which one of these guys are you leaning to?
I think out of those two, we've already seen the Vikings go up against Chicago. That was just maybe a month or so ago, and Sam Darnold passed for over 300 yards and threw for 2 touchdowns.
Yeah.
And that was when we weren't sure where Jordan Addison's place was in the pecking order, and we've seen Jordan Addison really start to ascend as a wide receiver. I'd say 1B to Justin Jefferson's 1A. So I give it to Sam Darnold in this matchup, but it's not. I'd say it's really close between him and Tua.
I have Darnold ahead. And if you look at our consensus rankings, they are right at the top of tier 2 for us. Darnold just ahead of Tua. I lean towards Darnold. I like that he's at home playing in a dome. So perfect circumstances for him. Tua on the road, but also playing in a dome. Tua in a dome has low key been fire.
Yeah.
And I do think that his matchup against the Texans is a little bit underappreciated. I don't think the Texans on defense are maybe quite as good as their numbers would indicate, but the Bears also have not been as good on defense recently. So I lean a little bit towards Darnold, but I will fully acknowledge it is pretty close between the two of them.
Yeah.
Next question that we have here from Let's Plant Some Trees. All right. Brian Thomas, Hopkins, Ridley, Mooney, need two of these in PPR. All right. I would say that just shooting from the hip, I would probably take Mooney out of that.
Yep.
And I would be tempted to take Hopkins out of it. Just because I don't know how much they're actually going to need to rely on Hopkins in this game. And it's a low scoring game that we have projected for Chiefs Browns anyway. So just shooting from the hip, I would lean towards Ridley. I would lean towards Brian Thomas, but that's just what I'm thinking before I actually started to look at the projections or rankings here. But what are your thoughts on these four?
No, I agree with that. BTJ, we know, is the wide receiver one for the Jags, even if he does have Mac Jones going up against him. And now also slightly more condensed with Evan Ingram going on IR with end of season shoulder surgery. So I'd say Brian Thomas is the easiest. Ridley, I'll also agree with that because the points I made earlier about him going up against the Cincinnati secondary, I'd say those are the two easiest paths to generating fantasy points. Whereas for Hopkins, it was good to see him pick up a few more targets this past week. I think it was only his second time with a 20+% target share since he joined Kansas City. But also for Cleveland, and I mentioned this earlier, a little bit of rain projected in the forecast for the Browns-Chiefs game. Not a ton to really affect passing rates, but it's just one of those, like, if we're making those considerations and having to try and delineate between who's the better play and who's not, we don't have those same concerns in the other games we just mentioned. And so while, again, you're getting targets from Patrick Mahomes, blah, 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 I'd say Brian Thomas, Calvin Ridley, like those are the better options there.
Yeah, that's what I'd go with, Ridley and Thomas. All right, next question that we have, presumably coming up, from Gustavo. Njoku or Ertz? So I mean Ertz. I'm assuming Njoku is definitely out. Didn't practice at all this week. Technically listed as questionable, but I think highly expected not to play. So and Ertz, I mean, I think he would be probably in the top 12 anyway, or on the borderline of the top 12. So someone that you would presumably feel somewhat comfortable starting in a normal league.
Yeah, top 10, top 12 right now. Consensus rankings, he's like right outside right at the top 10 mark for us. So, and with his usage so far in that Washington offense, no Noah Brown for the Commanders, so even fewer targets to go for around for Jaden Daniels. So yeah, it's easy.
Yeah, there you go. And plus, Ertz, old man coming out of the bye, presumably gets a little bit of a bump there.
Yeah.
All right, Mayfield or Winston. So you have Mayfield on the road, playing in the dome in LA, going against a Chargers defense that is missing number one cornerback Asante Samuel, and I would say like stingier on the ground than through the air. And then you have Winston playing outdoors in the elements, going against the Chiefs. Winston always willing to attack aggressively, but of course also, there's the downside of always capable of throwing 3 interceptions in a game. Where are you on Mayfield versus Winston?
Surprisingly enough, I'm with Winston on this one. Yeah, I noted the weather for that particular game, but we do know that Winston always has his fastball and he can grip it and rip it with whether or not it's in the snow or in the rain. And we've already seen him play in the snow just a few weeks ago. Mayfield, he's been banged up. We know Bucky is banged up. We know Evans has been, at least he's fine from a health standpoint, no real concerns, but with his practice regimen of being limited during the earlier parts of the week and him suiting up, it's just tough for the Bucs passing game so far the last 3 to 4 weeks. So I'll give it to Winston for this one. And now the Chiefs defense, I mean, their secondary hasn't been what it's been over the past couple of seasons. I mean, they have had a number of quarterbacks play well against them. I mean, shoot, we just saw Aiden O'Connell just a few weeks ago play really well against the Chiefs secondary. So while I know that their defensive up front will give Jameis some problems, I would say that both of them both him and Mayfield do have those bonehead games in them. Mayfield just threw for a couple of interceptions last week. I would say it's Winston, but I'd say it's close, but I do give it to Winston in this matchup.
So I love this question. I think it maybe gives some insight into how I think about making some fantasy decisions. So I have Winston at 16 and Mayfield at 17. So I have them right next to each other, basically saying like, I don't know, man, they're tied. And in a situation like this, I tend to rely on the other rankers that we have in our consensus to kind of give me a better sense of like, all right, I'm basically saying it's a tie. What are other smart people thinking between these two? And in our consensus rankings, we have Mayfield significantly ahead of Winston, like by 4 or 5 spots.
Yeah.
So even though I have Winston 1 spot ahead of Mayfield, but basically saying they're the same, knowing that Ian and Dwayne and Waz and Charge, and then, my rankings in there, but knowing that the 5 of us collectively have Mayfield a decent chunk above Winston, that would push me towards Mayfield. I think Mayfield has maybe the safer floor. Like Winston has a really high floor because he's always aggressive and he will accumulate yards, but he could also get a lot of interceptions that go along with that. And then like with the weather and the low total in that game, it kind of puts me off of it a little bit. So I lean towards Mayfield because of what we have going on in the consensus rankings, but I acknowledge that it is super close between these two. And if it were just me shooting from the hip, not consulting other resources, I would lean ever so slightly towards Winston, but knowing what other people have put in our rankings, that puts me towards Mayfield. All right. The next question that we have here from Ezra Nelson. Start 2. JSN, Myers, Neighbors, Shakir. Okay. This one I think is kind of tough because I love JSN. What he has done this year, emerging from the maybe we just call it like Shane Waldron funk of his rookie season. Like I was not even like, I would say the most optimistic of JSN truthers would not have anticipated what he's been able to do this year, given what we saw out of him as a rookie. So love the spot for JSN. And I love the spot even more because not only is he at home, but I think we will see the Seahawks as underdogs have to pass just a little bit more. And then he's going against a secondary, which is already number 32 in defensive dropback success rate. And now missing Jair Alexander and missing Javon Bullard, who has been playing as slot corner for the Packers recently. You have JSN playing the super majority of his snaps in the slot. So he's got, I think, a really good matchup. So I love JSN in this spot. Myers is interesting because now he's on the 3rd string quarterback. You kind of have to have questions as to whether Desmond Ridder can operate the passing game as effectively as Aiden O'Connell could. But you still look at Jacoby and think that he's probably in line for like 8 to 10 targets. Like that's just sort of like what is allocated for him at this point. We talked about Neighbors earlier. Shakir is interesting in that, like, I think it's pretty fair to say he's the number 1 wide receiver in that offense at this point. But Keon Coleman is returning, and I think a decent chance that we see Dalton Kincaid in this game as well. So maybe some of those opportunities that were funneling towards Shakir because of just decreased competition, maybe he doesn't get some of those. So what are your thoughts on the 4 of these guys, knowing we need 2 of them?
So Myers, I'm 100% with you. He should be the one that's locked in to one of those slots. I would think, just looking at the game environment for Shakir, he'd be the other one that I would start. And if this is also a PPR league, definitely start him. You mentioned he's the wide receiver 1 for the Bills, and with him playing in the slot, going up against Detroit, Amik Robinson, their slot corner, he's the one that you would particularly want to target. And that is essentially how you get through Detroit's secondary. And Freedman, correct me if I'm wrong. That is the highest total on today's set of games. 55. Is that where it's sitting at?
Yeah,
Somewhere in there.
54.5, 55. Not just the highest total for this week, the highest total we have seen for any game this year.
Okay.
Like
Yeah.
it is a shootout that is definitely expected at Ford Stadium.
Yeah, so that's where I would lean a bit more towards trying to get at least a piece in that game. So if you do get one of the pieces that should be heavily targeted, or at least we can project it to him to be one of the more targeted players in that environment, JSN, Khalil Shakir, I think that's how I would look at delineating between those four guys.
Okay, I would lock in JSN. He's the first that I would put in there. I would be a little bit more skeptical about Myers. I love Myers, but I think there's a little more downside that he has with Desmond Ridder as the starter. And then Shakir, I can see wanting to get a piece of that game, but again, I'm just a little bit more skeptical with Keon Coleman returning, with Dalton Kincaid returning. It feels disgusting to say I would go with Neighbors. Because like he's got the same situation with the number 3 quarterback, or however it is you won't think of Tommy DeVito, but he's certainly a backup quarterback throwing to him as Myers. And I will say, looking at the projections, I have Neighbors and then Myers and Shakir. I have it in that order, but as a staff, we have it flipped. We have Myers, Shakir, and Neighbors. So, I would say JSN
for sure.
I'm definitely locking in.
Yeah.
And then between those three, I lean a little bit towards Neighbors. As a staff, we lean towards Myers. I think they are both in similar situations. High target volume you would expect. But just not. You know what? I think I'm going to go with Neighbors. And the reason is I think he's got the volume and he's going against still one of the weakest secondaries in the league. Mm-hmm. I would go with Neighbors, but I would say it's Neighbors or Myers. All right. Question from Tom Chop. Half PPR, sit one of these guys. Kamara, Connor, Chase Brown, Charbonnet. My man, I think you're basically just asking this question so you can brag about how awesome your backfield is right now. Good on you. Congratulations. So sitting one of them, I'm not sitting Charbonnet, who could have just the massive full workload on Sunday Night Football at home going against the Packers. I'm not sitting Chase Brown, who, again, just has been awesome as the lead back for the Bengals, especially since Zach Moss has been out. Just one of the highest scoring offenses in the league. I'm not sitting him. Alvin Kamara. I would be very reluctant to sit him. I know he's playing with a backup quarterback, but with all of the wide receivers who are out, with Taysom Hill out, it just feels like Alvin Kamara, like the question is just like, how many touches physically can this guy withstand? It feels like that is the workload that he's getting. But then, of course, you have James Conner at home as a favorite going against the Patriots. So all four of these guys you want to start. So like that, I would say that is the starting point. But Chase Brown, I am for sure locking in. Yes. Zach Charbonnet, I am for sure locking in. And then it's between Connor and Kamara. Man, I would natively want to lean towards Kamara just because he's been awesome for so long. But James Conner as a big favorite at home, and playing with Kyler versus playing with Jake Haener, that probably puts me towards Connor. So it feels so disrespectful to say I am not starting Alvin Kamara, but that's probably the situation that I'm going with.
No, I don't disagree with you there. Actually, Alvin Kamara popped up sick earlier in the week. He missed a couple of practices, and also he did make it back for a limited session on Friday. So I don't think there's any concern. But with Kendre Miller playing well in his first game back last week, I think there's enough to say there that I would take Kamara out of there, whereas we don't have workload concerns for James Conner. Actually, even fewer concerns with Amari DiMercato going on IR just this past week. And so I'd say all those guys are locked in, no question about it, RB1s for their team. whereas Kamara, along with the offensive efficiency situation for him with the backup quarterback going for the Saints against the Washington Commanders defense, no rushing touchdowns in the past couple of weeks. Saquon Barkley, of course, ran over them 3 to 4 weeks ago. Rico Dowdle, 86 yards on the ground, no touchdown. Tony Pollard, before going into their bye, 35 yards on the ground with no touchdown. So Commanders defense actually has been fairly stingy to opposing running backs for the past 3 to 4 weeks outside of the Barkley game. So Kamara, I think he's just a cut below all the rest of those guys.
Yeah, and that's how we have it ranked as a staff. We have Kamara as the number 4 guy in that cohort. A great backfield situation. Best of luck to you there. All right, Laporta or Ferguson. I don't remember all that many tight end questions that we've gotten to this point.
Our first one.
But we definitely have not talked about either one of these guys. Ferguson is intriguing in that he's got a great tight end matchup against the Panthers. I honestly like a lot of the Cowboys skill position players this week going against the Panthers. But Laporta in that high scoring game environment, indoors going against the Bills, Laporta gets the nod for me over Jake Ferguson. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I'm with you. Even though we can see a scenario where it's an Amon-Ra type of game, it could be a Jameson Williams explosive game. And of course, we didn't even mention the running backs. They could run all over the Bills' defensive front. So there, although all the game script concerns can be there for Laporta, I would just rather have a piece of that game. And we do know that he's around 15-20% of the targets, and that's enough for the tight end position. So I like Laporta a little bit more than Ferguson.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Next question that we have here. Kincaid, Ferguson, or Henry PPR question from Todd Culver. All right. So we talked about Ferguson. Kincaid, expecting him to return, at least I'm expecting him to return. And then we have Henry, who has kind of gone back and forth, like in terms of like the amount of work that he's getting, but now at this point solidly looks like the tight end 1 for the Patriots. And like almost across the board, we have him ranked as the number 11 guy at the position this week, ahead of Kincaid, ahead of Ferguson. I would lean towards Hunter Henry, but I do think Kincaid might have like the higher theoretical ceiling, but I would say like Henry for sure has the higher projectable floor. What are your thoughts on these 3 guys?
No, that's exactly it. I mean, Henry working with Drake May, and we've seen their chemistry so far throughout the season. Yes, I know Austin Hooper has gotten into the end zone a couple of times to the chagrin of folks that are rostering Hunter Henry. I think the target should be there. The matchup should be fairly good. We just talked about our at least like of Kyler Murray in this game as well. So if it's going to be one of those back and forth types of matchups, I mean, I think it's Henry, then Kincaid, and then Ferguson, I think, is probably the way that I look at it, but I think it's pretty close between the 3 of them.
All right. Next question that we have here. Commanders or Cardinals defense? All right. Love the DST streaming questions. And obviously, I would advise everyone, not just for those questions, for all the questions, be sure to check out the rankings that we have on the site. So the Commanders going against a backup quarterback in Jake Haener, absolutely fantastic setup for the Commanders, who are favored by 7.5. They are on the road
too. Yeah.
But like the Commanders, like what ultimately is most predictable for defensive points is the spread. So if you have a team that is a big favorite, that means that normally the opposing offense has to drop back more to pass, which means that there are more sack opportunities for the defense, which means more opportunities for interceptions, for pressures, for fumbles, recovery for touchdowns. Like all of that just kind of flows from, oh, is this team a big favorite? And you have that with the Commanders. And then you have the Cardinals, also favored by a decent number of points, favored by 6. Cardinals at home going against Drake May. I think of this as Drake May is better than Jake Haener. So I would go with the Commanders. But in our rankings, we have Commanders and Cardinals right next to each other. Commanders one spot ahead of the Cardinals. I would go with Commanders, but either one of these looks like a great option.
Yeah, and Commanders already talked about how stingy they've been to opposing running backs. And then from the secondary standpoint, this should be the debut of Marshawn Lattimore going up against his former team. So I think their secondary gets a much needed boost. We've seen a lot of passers get over on him, but it's Jake Haener with Jake Haener equipped with what Bub Means and Marquez Valdez-Scantling. So I'm not too terribly concerned about that. I mean, a long touchdown is probably going to happen for MVS because that's what he does. But Commanders defense is the better option out of those two.
Yeah. Brutal run out for Jake Haener in his first NFL start.
Tough.
All right. Flowers or Devontae Smith. So we've talked about Smith earlier. Tough situation for him, given the matchup going against the Steelers in an offense that isn't throwing the ball all that much. About 10% of the time when Jalen Hurts does drop back, he scrambles. And then when he chooses to pass the ball, heavily targeting the direction of AJ Brown, which makes sense, but just means tough situation for Smith. Flowers coming out of the bye, good spot for him there. Going against the Giants. By the way, the Giants could be without their 3 starting cornerbacks in this game. So great setup for him just in terms of the matchup. The downside is that his team is favored by almost 17 points, which means like it could just be a Derrick Henry game where like the situation is great for Zay Flowers, but the Ravens might not need to throw the ball all that much in order to win running away. So it could just be decreased opportunities for Zay Flowers. That said, anytime your team is projected to win by 16 and a half, 17 points, that kind of implies that your team is going to score a lot of points. And if that happens, maybe even if Zay Flowers doesn't get that many targets, he could still find the end zone. How are you looking at Flowers versus Smith?
At least for me, I'm with you where the environment is so good that it just could be everybody scoring, and then Zay Flowers not really getting into the mix. But I'd still give it to Zay Flowers in this matchup. Devonta Smith, even though he was the one that scored a touchdown just this past week, all the narratives going more towards like AJ Brown, not just from a season-long standpoint. He has been one of the higher-end target earners within the Eagles offense. Devonta Smith like has mixed in here and there, but hasn't really separated out, even gotten into that 1B conversation that we saw at points last year. Whereas with Zay Flowers, he has really taken over the reins for the Ravens. And so while there's a case where Lamar Jackson gets there as a rusher, Derrick Henry gets there as a rusher against the Giants front that has been more susceptible to ground attacks over these past few weeks. I mean, no Dexter Lawrence. I mean, all of the injuries that they've sustained. I'll give it to Flowers given his workload so far as relative to Devonta Smith's. But I mean, both I think are really solid options. But I think it's Flowers.
All right. One more question here. Yes. Anytime we can get the Stone Smart question, you know it's the last
Stone
question
Cold Smart
of the day. Yeah, exactly. Stone Cold Smart.
Hello.
All right. So we've got Titan Pitts, Stone Cold Smart, or Jawan Johnson. This is kind of tough for me because there's like some vibes that goes in to answering this versus just like, hey, here's what I have in my projections and here's what I have in my rankings.
Yeah.
So, Kyle Pitts, massive disappointment, but this week, at least going against the Raiders, who are bottom 5 in pass defense against tight ends. For most of the season, they've been without their starting strong safety, Marcus Epps. Stone Smart, no Hayden Hurst, who is on IR, no Will Dissly, who exited last week with an injury and is out this week. And then potentially, we talked about earlier, potentially no Ladd McConkey, which could just mean a lot of targets available for the guys who are left in that offense with a truncated passing tree. And then Juwan Johnson, no Taysom Hill, a number of wide receivers out, but he does have Jake Haener throwing the ball to him. What are your thoughts on these 3 guys?
I want to lean more towards Juwan Johnson because at least from a floor standpoint, he was out there, I mean, running a route on about 80% of the snaps over the past couple of weeks. And then he's almost gotten to that 20% target share. Now that's like, to your point, without having a number of pass catchers there on the field. But My concern now without Derek Carr being out there for the Saints and going up against the Commanders, we just mentioned we like the Commanders defense against the Saints. I'll go with Smart. It sounds disgusting, but if we like their matchup, for the Chargers as a whole, going up against Tampa Bay secondary, who's going to be without multiple defenders, I think that's where at least you can see a scenario where a guy like Smart can give you that floor and a potential ceiling if he falls into the end zone. Because we do know that the Chargers, they have been one to pass once they get into the red zone. Not a ton, but enough that a guy like Stone Smart, if he continues to earn targets like he just did this past week, fewer options in the Chargers passing game, I could see a scenario where that's the guy that you would want to have. Whereas for Pitts, yeah, we've been pining over him getting the volume for however many weeks and or years. So I think it's between Smart and Johnson, and I give the slightest of leans to Stone Cold Smart.
All right. The answer that I want to give is the one that no one wants to hear.
It's going to be Kyle Pitts.
I would say I would go with Kyle Pitts, but if you are just like washing your hands, you're done with Kyle Pitts, Juwan Johnson is the one that I would go with. He does have the backup quarterback throwing to him, which isn't great. But we at least have a sense of like the number of routes he's going to be running, the targets he's likely to be getting. I think given the lack of competition that he has for opportunities, and the fact that like we just have more of a track record with him versus Stone Smart, I would probably go with Juwan Johnson, but I do think Stone Smart is viable.
Yeah.
So man, can't believe we talked about Stone Smart. It's the real sign of where we are in the season. Massive appreciation to everyone for jumping in to the chat, asking us the questions. It has been a real pleasure and privilege to get to interact with you guys for this hour and a half, sometimes every Sunday. This is going to be the last live stream that we do of the regular season. You know, we got the holiday season coming up, and the powers that be granted us our Sundays off for the next couple of weeks. So, but of course, as always, if you have those fantasy football questions, and of course you do, go to the rankings, go to the site, check out the content there. And of course, the start sit tool that we have, which I think is one of the best just tools, period. Not like best start sit tools, period, but just one of the best tools, period, in the industry. Definitely go check that out and utilize that to help you make your decisions on Sunday mornings as you progress throughout the playoffs and ultimately dominate the competition on your way to a championship. Chris, have a fantastic week 15 and also holiday season. You got any big plans coming up?
No, we're hanging out at the house for the most part. I might be doing a little bit of cooking, but other than that, just spending time with family. So best of luck to you, Freedman. It's been a blast kicking it with you this season. Hopefully we get to do it again next year. But yeah, good luck to everybody else fighting for a championship in week 15. Hopefully we've been able to do everything that you need from us from an analysis standpoint. Hit us up on Twitter. If you need us for more questions, we'll be around for the next couple of hours as well. So we'll always be around, but go to the site. Check out all the tools we got in the meantime.
All right. Appreciate everyone. Have a fantastic week 15 and holiday season, and best of luck to you in all of your fantasy endeavors. For Chris, I'm Freedman, and take care, everyone.